A safe day in wild country can look identical to a dangerous one, until a single detail tips the balance. Darkness, fog, and scent can work like a curtain, hiding movement while pulling it closer. In seconds, a quiet campsite, a work site, or a research station can become a narrow corridor with no clean exit. Tonight's documentary follows 6 separate encounters where timing and conditions aligned fast. Each story is examined clearly, step by step, with practical lessons that investigators and survivors carried forward. The northern edge of British Columbia's Skeena backcountry is a place of long valleys and short sight lines, where spruce stands grow tight and damp air sits low even in summer. A deactivated logging spur runs along a creek there, ending in a rough turnaround used by anglers and occasional survey crews. On maps, it looks like open space. On the ground, it feels enclosed by brush. At 7:42 p.m. on September 14th, 2024, the light began to flatten into gray as cloud cover thickened. Temperature hovered around 49 degrees Fahrenheit, 9 degrees Celsius, and the creek's noise filled gaps that normally carry warning. In the soft evening, visibility shortened to roughly 40 yards before alder thickets swallowed the line of sight. A 2-person fisheries team had parked a white pickup at the turnaround and walked gear down to the water. Naomi Laird, 31, worked for a provincial monitoring program and spent most of her season recording spawn counts. Her partner, Mateo Rios, 35, was a contract technician with a habit of double-checking knots and batteries before anything else. They were there to collect water samples and tag a short stretch of habitat. Routine work meant to take less than 2 hours. The bear was a coastal grizzly, an adult male estimated later at roughly 700 pounds, 318 kilograms, made heavier by late summer feeding. In that region, salmon runs can create predictable movement corridors. But that evening the run was thin, and the bear's attention shifted to easier calories. Investigators would later point to one key driver. Human food odor carried downwind along the creek like a narrow ribbon. The trigger was small and ordinary. Naomi had opened a cooler in the bed of the truck and left it unlatched while she rinsed sample bottles. Inside were sandwiches, fruit, and a bag of smoked fish. The smell mixed with damp wood and creek water. The vehicle sat about 18 yards from the brush line. At approximately 7:58 p.m., alder branches flexed once, then went still. The next motion came closer than either worker expected. The bear stepped onto the gravel spur without announcing itself, head low, moving with the unhurried certainty of an animal that has found an option worth testing. The escalation lasted measured minutes, not a blur. The bear crossed half the turnaround in under 10 seconds and rose up against the truck bed, 4 paws slamming metal with a hollow thud. The cooler lid snapped back. Naomi backed away toward the driver's side door, and Mateo moved to the passenger side, trying to keep the truck between them and the animal. The bear dropped, circled, and then surged again, this time raking a claw across the tailgate and shoving its snout deep into the open cooler. Mateo hit the truck's panic alarm. The horn burst sharp through the creek noise. Naomi grabbed a flare from a roadside kit and struck it, holding the bright sputter low and angled away from her face. The bear flinched at the light, then did not retreat, an important detail later noted in the report. It pivoted, track and movement, and advanced 2 steps toward Naomi, closing to roughly 12 feet. Naomi held her ground long enough to toss the flare onto open gravel between them. It hissed and spat. Mateo kept the horn cycling while he shouted, short, controlled, not frantic. The bear hesitated, swung its head, and then returned to the cooler, dragging the bag of smoked fish out with a single pull. With the food secured, it backed toward the brush and disappeared with surprising speed, leaving only a crushed cooler corner and fresh gouges in painted metal. In the resolution phase, neither worker was physically attacked, but the aftermath still carried injury in a quieter way. Naomi's hands shook hard enough that she dropped a radio twice, and Mateo's breathing stayed shallow for nearly an hour. They drove 11 miles to the nearest service road junction before stopping, and only then reported the incident via satellite text when reception returned. Officials arrived the next morning and measured tracks, claw marks, and distances. They noted the cooler latch, the downwind corridor, and the proximity of brush to the turnaround. Their conclusion was direct. Unsecured attractants plus noise masking from moving water reduced response time to nearly nothing. The worksite later installed a bear-resistant storage box and required food to remain sealed inside the cab, not the bed. When scent is present and sightlines are short, just a minute of unsecured food can become the entire window a bear needs. Between incidents, the pattern rarely looks dramatic on paper. It looks like weather, terrain, and routine, three forces that don't feel dangerous until they overlap. The next story moves to a colder place, where sound travels far, but visibility fails completely. Kalalit Nunat's western Greenland coast is defined by rock, ice, and long blue twilight. Near the outer edge of a small research lease north of Sisimiut, a temporary instrument station sat on wind-packed snow above sea ice. The camp wasn't large: 2 tents, a generator, and a line of stakes marking safe routes around pressure ridges. At 5:18 a.m. on April 3rd, 2025, the temperature read -7 degrees Fahrenheit, -22 degrees Celsius. Wind gusts hit 28 miles per hour, pushing loose snow into sheets that erased contrast. Under headlamps, the world narrowed to a bright cone and a dark perimeter. Dr. Lena Koivisto, 42, was a visiting glaciologist logging iceflex data before spring melt. A local field assistant, Malik Peterson, 29, handled routes and radio schedules. Their plan was to download sensor cards, reseat a battery pack, and return inside before daylight strengthened the wind. The animal context in this environment is unforgiving. A polar bear, adult male, estimated at roughly 1,000 pounds, 454 kilograms, had been seen earlier in the week along a lead of open water about 2.3 miles away. Thin ice and shifting seals can push bears into wider wandering, especially when wind funnels scent. The trigger came from a single oversight in a process normally rigid. During the previous evening's work, a sealed food case had been opened inside the vestibule for inventory. A package of dried fish was returned, but the latch didn't fully engage. In calm weather it might have held. In wind, the lid flexed enough to vent odor. At 5:26 a.m., Malik noticed what looked like a low white boulder where no boulder existed. The shape moved against the wind. For several seconds, his brain refused to label it. Then it angled directly toward the tents. The escalation was fast and spatially simple. The bear came straight in, covering approximately 60 yards in under half a minute. It didn't roar. It didn't charge like a film scene. It arrived with the steady violence of mass meeting fabric. The outer tent wall buckled as the bear hit it shoulder first, snapping one pole and collapsing a corner into the snow. Lena stumbled backward, boots skidding on hard pack. Malik fired a handheld air horn at point-blank range, the sound slicing through wind. The bear pivoted toward him instead of away, another detail that mattered later, then dropped its head and pushed toward the vestibule, pawing at the half-latched food case until plastic cracked. Malik pulled a flare pistol from a dry tube and fired at a shallow angle into open snow, roughly 15 feet in front of the animal. The flare struck, burned bright, and rolled, throwing a moving line of light across the drift. The bear paused, blinking, then took 2 backward steps. It did not run. It circled, testing the boundary of sound and heat. Lena activated an emergency beacon and moved behind the generator frame, using it as a barrier. Malik kept the horn in short bursts, 2 seconds on, 2 off, trying to prevent the bear from habituating to a continuous tone. After an estimated 3 minutes of circling, the bear grabbed a torn corner of packaging, mouthed it, then turned toward the darker edge of the pressure ridge and walked away, prints deep and deliberate. The resolution wasn't relief so much as a controlled exit. Lana and Malik stayed in place for another 20 minutes, listening for return steps. They did not chase the bear off the line of travel. They secured remaining food in hard cases and waited until a scheduled support snowmobile reached them at 7:05 a.m. Aftermath included bruising on Lena's hip from a fall and frost-numbed fingers on Malik's left hand. But the psychological impact ran deeper. Both reported intrusive lamp cone anxiety for weeks, describing how darkness outside the beam felt like an active space. Officials later concluded the camp's perimeter was too close to a scent corridor along open water and required future stations to place food storage downwind and 50 yards away from sleeping tents, with tripwire alarms added. In polar conditions, small storage failures become magnified because wind can carry odor farther than your visibility can reach. Not every danger arrives in open snow. Sometimes it moves through heat and brush, where people assume they'll hear it first. The next encounter begins in daylight, but under cover so dense it functions like night. In the coastal foothills of Santa Cruz County, California, chaparral can form walls, oak, manzanita, and bay laurel tangled so tightly that even noonlight fractures into patches. A narrow service trail near a rural canyon leads to a cluster of homes and a small community garden, bordered by a creek bed that stays shaded most of the year. At 2:11 p.m. on June 22nd, 2023, the temperature was 81 degrees Fahrenheit, 27 degrees Celsius in the open, but the canyon trail felt cooler. Cicadas buzzed high, and the creek's trickle masked smaller sounds. Visibility on the trail was roughly 25 yards in many spots, because foliage bowed inward. Tariq Mendez, 28, was walking back from the garden with a crate of compost and a bag of chicken feed. He lived nearby, worked in landscape maintenance, and used the trail as a shortcut. With him was his dog, a 55-pound, 25 kilograms, mixed breed, named Nola, leashed but alert, nose working the edges. The animal context here wasn't a bear but a big cat, a mountain lion, adult female, estimated around 110 pounds, 50 kilograms. Drought conditions earlier that year had shifted deer movement, and trail cameras in the region had recorded the same lion crossing near the creek at dawn. Wildlife staff later noted that subadult dispersal and prey scarcity can increase daylight risk, especially along shaded corridors that allow cats to move unseen. The trigger was not food left out, but a combination of timing and small behavior cues. As Tariq rounded a bend, Nola stiffened and stared into the brush. Tariq, thinking she'd scented a rabbit, stepped closer to keep her moving. That closed distance, perhaps 10 feet closer than necessary, reduced his reaction time to almost nothing. The escalation was shockingly brief. The lion launched from the left bank in a low arc, aiming not for Tariq, but for the dog. Nola yelped as weight hit her shoulders. The leash snapped taut, jerking Tariq forward off balance. Dust and dry leaves exploded upward. For 2 seconds, Tariq did not see the cat clearly, only motion and the sound of a struggle in brush. Human response was improvised and immediate. Tariq dropped the chicken feed bag and shouted, a single loud command that carried more authority than panic. He stepped in, using the compost crate as a barrier, slamming its edge into the ground between cat and dog. The lion released and backed 1 step, ears flat, eyes fixed on movement. Tariq raised his arms, stayed upright, and backed toward a wider patch of trail, keeping Nola close and preventing the cat from circling behind. A neighbor, hearing yelling from roughly 80 yards away, stepped out near a fence line and hit a car alarm. The sudden siren changed the soundscape, flattening the lion's advantage. The cat paused, then flowed back into the chaparral, disappearing as if the brush swallowed it. Resolution came without human mauling, but Nola suffered puncture wounds to her shoulder and required emergency veterinary care. Tariq had bruised knees and a strained wrist from being pulled forward. In the following weeks, he avoided the trail entirely, describing a persistent bend fear, a sense that every corner could hide a silent shape. Official analysis focused on corridor design. Wildlife officers posted temporary closure signs and trimmed vegetation back from key bends to improve sight lines. Residents were urged to keep dogs leashed, but also to avoid allowing pets to lead into blind corners. Camera monitoring increased, and the community installed motion lights near the garden access point. Predators that rely on ambush gain most of their advantage at blind corners. Wider visibility and controlled movement reduce that advantage. The next story returns to a more familiar symbol of wilderness, a bear near camp. But the setting is not deep backcountry. It's a place where people assume help is close, and that assumption changes behavior. The eastern slope of Colorado's San Juan Mountains holds a network of dispersed campsites used by hunters, hikers, and families looking for weekend quiet. One particular site sits near a trailhead parking area, about 0.6 miles from a paved road. Close enough to hear distant engines, far enough to feel alone after dusk. At 9:37 p.m. on October 2nd, 2022, temperature was 36 degrees Fahrenheit, 2 degrees Celsius. A thin, cold fog drifted through ponderosa pines, and a light wind carried smoke sideways from a small campfire. Visibility beyond the fire ring was no more than 30 feet. The night felt contained. Celia Park, 33, and her brother Andrew Park, 30, had driven in after work for a short overnight. Celia taught middle school science and planned the trip as a reset. Andrew was an EMT, confident and practical, and brought a first aid kit that looked more prepared than their food storage system. They had a single 2-person tent, a cooler, and a soft-sided snack bag. The animal context was a black bear, Adult male, later estimated around 280 pounds, 127 kilograms. Autumn is a period of heavy feeding, and in that area, bears frequently learn that trailhead-adjacent camps provide easy calories. Wildlife officers later noted multiple prior reports of a bear testing vehicles and coolers in the same zone. The trigger was a preventable overlap. Grease odor. After dinner, Andrew poured bacon fat into an empty can and set it near the fire ring to cool. The can remained open. The snack bag sat inside the tent vestibule, zipped but not bear-resistant. In fog, odor lingers low and travels along the ground. At 9:52 p.m., a soft crunch sounded just beyond the fire's edge. Too quiet to be a person, too heavy to be a squirrel. The bear emerged as a dark mass against fog, head low, moving straight for the fire ring. It went to the grease can first, licking, then shoved it over with a paw, spilling residue into ash. The escalation was aggressive but focused. The bear moved to the cooler, struck it once, and cracked a latch. Celia shouted and backed toward the car, pressing the key fob to trigger the horn. The horn blared, and the headlights flashed, slicing fog into bright sheets. The bear startled, then turned toward the tent instead, drawn by the vestibule scent. Andrew stepped forward, not running, holding a bright headlamp at eye level and banging a metal pot with a spoon, metallic clanging that cut through the fog. Celia used bear spray as a ready tool, not firing immediately, keeping distance at roughly 20 feet. The bear huffed, swatted at the tent fabric once, then wheeled toward the cooler again. After an estimated 4 minutes of repeated testing, cooler, tent edge, grease spot, the bear finally withdrew when a second vehicle entered the parking area, tires crunching gravel and doors slamming. The added human noise changed the calculation. The bear vanished into the trees, leaving a torn cooler lid and a ripped vestibule seam. Resolution meant packing up immediately. Celia and Andrew slept in the locked car, seats reclined, eyes flicking to every headlight reflection in the fog. The next day, Andrew cleaned ash-stained grease from the fire ring and reported the incident to rangers. Aftermath included no major injuries, but both described persistent hypervigilance for months, especially Celia, who found that the smell of smoke triggered a physical stress response. Official analysis was blunt. The proximity to a trailhead increased bear habituation, and the grease can create a concentrated attractant. The site later received a bear-proof trash and food locker, and rangers increased late-evening patrols during peak season. Educational signage emphasized grease and scraps must be sealed and removed from sleeping areas immediately. Near high-traffic camps, bears often arrive already conditioned. Removing concentrated odors is the fastest way to reduce risk. Not every incident happens outdoors. The next account begins in a place people believe is secure. A small rural home on the edge of wild land, where boundaries are thin and routines are predictable. In the foothills of western Slovakia, villages can sit directly against beech forest, with gardens and sheds forming a soft border rather than a hard line. One such home stood at the end of a narrow lane, backing onto a slope of mixed trees and berry patches that draw wildlife in late summer. At 4:56 a.m. on August 31st, 2021, the air was 58 degrees Fahrenheit, 14 degrees Celsius. Dawn had not fully arrived, and low fog sat across the yard in a shallow layer. A single porch light flickered, attracting moths and casting uneven shadows against a stacked wood pile. Marek Hrasko, 52, a night shift mechanic, had come home early and fallen asleep in a chair near the kitchen window. His sister-in-law, Eliska Hrasko, 46, was staying temporarily with her 12-year-old son, Tomas, during renovations at her own apartment. A small terrier, about 18 pounds, 8 kilograms, slept near the back door. The family was not expecting visitors of any kind. The animal context was a European brown bear, young adult male, estimated around 350 pounds, 159 kilograms. Local wildlife staff had noted increased bear movement through the village edge due to drought-reduced forest forage and the draw of fruit trees and compost. The trigger was a cluster of attractants, fallen plums and an uncovered compost bin less than 10 meters from the back door. Overnight, fruit odor fermented slightly, creating a stronger scent trail. At 5:03 a.m., the terrier began a sharp, rapid bark, high and insistent. Marek woke and looked through the window, expecting a fox. Instead, he saw a bear moving along the fence line, head sweeping left and right, following scent toward the compost. The escalation came when a boundary failed. The bear rose, hooked the compost lid with a claw, and pulled. The lid popped. Plastic scraped against concrete. Eliska, startled by noise, turned on the kitchen light. That sudden illumination backlit her in the window, an unintentional signal. The bear swung its head toward the house and moved closer, not sprinting, but closing distance with purpose. Marek did not open the door. That choice likely mattered. He grabbed a car key fob and triggered the alarm. He also hit a wall-mounted panic siren installed after recent village thefts, an improvised but effective deterrent. The siren wailed, the car horn layered on top, and the porch light flickered brighter as the electrical load shifted. The bear hesitated, then approached the door anyway, placing a paw against it, with enough pressure to make the frame creak. Tomas, now awake, began to cry. Eliska pulled him into an interior hallway, away from windows, keeping voices low. Marek shouted from inside, striking a metal ladle against a cast-iron pan, short, hard impacts. After approximately 2 minutes at the door, the bear turned back to the compost, grabbed a mouthful of fruit scraps, and moved away along the fence, stopping once to look back at the house. It then disappeared into fog near the tree line. Resolution came with no direct breach of the house, but the aftermath was immediate. Marek's hands shook so badly he struggled to dial the local wildlife hotline. By 6:10 a.m., municipal officers and a wildlife responder arrived, documenting paw prints on the door and torn compost plastic. The family spent the next week sleeping with interior doors closed and lights staged for quick activation. Official analysis identified the compost placement and fruit trees as the primary draw. The village began offering subsidized bear-resistant bins and organized a late summer fruit collection program. Residents were instructed to remove fallen fruit nightly and keep compost locked or indoors. The Hrasko home reinforced the doorframe and installed motion-activated lighting away from windows to avoid silhouette effects. At the wildland edge, compost and fruit can function like a feeder. Moving or securing them changes the odds before an animal reaches the door. The final story shifts to open water and a different kind of enclosure. People often assume a boat offers separation. In reality, it can become a narrow platform with nowhere to step back. Along Alaska's Kenai Peninsula, some salmon streams widen into slow tidal flats, where boats can nose into shallow water at low tide. The banks are muddy, the grass high, and sightlines depend on wind direction and light. On calm days, it feels spacious. On still days, it can feel like a bowl. At 6:24 p.m. on July 18th, 2020, the temperature was 62 degrees Fahrenheit, 17 degrees Celsius, and the air was unusually still. A thin, overcast softened shadows, making movement in grass harder to detect until it was close. The tide was dropping, leaving a band of exposed mud about 25 yards wide along the shoreline. Evan Cho, 27, and Brianna Sloan, 26, were recreational anglers in a 16-foot aluminum skiff anchored roughly 40 feet from the bank. Evan worked as a maritime mechanic and knew engines well. Brianna was a graduate student in environmental policy, eager to learn the fishery but new to bear country. They had caught several salmon and placed filleted remains into a plastic bag in an open bucket near the stern, planning to dispose of it later at a designated station. The animal was a brown bear, adult female, estimated around 420 pounds, 191 kilograms. In midsummer, bears patrol stream mouths for fish and scavenge remains left by anglers. A still evening can carry fish scent across water with unusual clarity. The trigger was exactly that, fish waste left exposed. The smell wasn't dramatic, just persistent, and it traveled low over water like an invisible line. At 6:31 p.m., Brianna noticed grass bending along the bank. The bear emerged, wet up to its knees, and walked directly toward the waterline opposite their boat. It did not look angry. It looked focused. The escalation unfolded in tight geography. The bear entered the shallows, closing the gap to the skiff in under a minute, and rose once, front paws splashing down, testing depth. Evan started the outboard immediately, but the prop churned mud, too shallow for clean thrust. The engine revved high with minimal movement. That sound, loud and sharp in still air, did not scare the bear. It drew attention. The bear surged forward and slapped the side of the skiff with one paw. Aluminum rang. The boat rocked hard enough that Brianna fell to her knees, hands catching on a bench. Evan grabbed the open bucket and dumped fish remains overboard, an instinctive attempt to redirect focus away from the boat itself. The bear's head snapped to the splash. It lunged, mouth opening, and for a moment its front half pressed against the gunnel, claws scraping metal. Evan hit the emergency horn attached to the console. Brianna grabbed a marine flare, snapped the cap, and held it outward over the water, heat hissing. The bright flare made the bear recoil slightly, but the bigger change came from depth. The bear couldn't keep leverage in the shifting mud. It dropped back into the shallows, focused on the floating scraps instead of the boat. As it fed, Evan trimmed the motor and pushed the skiff with a pole, slowly, deliberately, until the prop found deeper water. By 6:36 p.m., they were moving, leaving a widening gap. The bear remained in the shallows, head down, feeding, no longer invested in the boat once an easier option existed. Resolution ended without injury, but aftermath included bruises on Brianna's knees and a cut on Evan's forearm from grabbing a metal edge during the rock. More significant was the delayed shock. Brianna reported later that the metallic ring of the paw strike replayed in her head when she tried to sleep. Evan, despite marine experience, described a rare feeling of helplessness when the engine's power didn't translate into movement. Officials reviewed the event based on their report and concluded that fish waste storage practices were the primary risk factor. Disposal rules were reinforced at local launch points. and signage emphasized sealed containers and immediate waste management. Some access sites installed dedicated fish cleaning stations with secure disposal to reduce shoreline attractants. A boat isn't a barrier if scent draws an animal into shallow water. Secure waste early, because escape options shrink fast.